Future Everything is delighted to be curating the Innovate Manchester program on behalf of Midas and GC Business Growth Hub. The events are part of a wider ERDF funded program designed to facilitate innovative business collaborations across Greater Manchester. I'm George Konstantakopoulos, Business Innovation Lead for Future Everything, an award-winning arts, culture, and innovation agency, and a Manchester board and based female-led social enterprise. We're very proud and excited to be producing and curating the Innovate Manchester program. Quickly through the agenda for the day, there are 4 main items. The keynote from Professor Andy Maya, then the thought provocations from Emmer, Michael, and Annette, who are going to be introduced later, from our chair for the day, Vika Shah. Thank you everyone for being here today with us. And then I'm going to provide some more insight on the innovation labs and the program. The Business Growth Hub team is an important part of the program and a partner, and a core element of that is that their innovation team is here to provide one-to-one expert tailored support. This is at no cost for your organization. Also, they will guide you through any available funding, and including the £5,000 innovation vouchers, which are there to help you gain access into experts, research, and specialist facilities. They will get in touch following the webinar today and throughout the next days to provide more information about the support and the team. And also you can get in touch with them directly to the email that you can see on my screen. And let's move on to the program introduction. So the Innovate Manchester program is an ambitious new events program for Greater Manchester. The events are designed to bring together large organizations, SMEs, the public sector, and academia to collaborate on new innovative ideas. The program is focusing in 4 thematic areas. We have already completed the first theme. You might have been part of it, changing the way we produce and consume. And now we are currently on the second theme, which is our digital futures, data, and ethics. Now, the third theme and the next one up is the sustainable cities and infrastructure, with a webinar taking place on November 23rd and the Innovation Lab 2 weeks after, on the 9th and 10th of December. The last theme for the Innovate Manchester program is the future of human experiences and human-centric design. The webinar is taking place on the 10th of February 2021, and the Innovation Labs again roughly 2 weeks after, on the 24th and 25th of February. The program is designed, as we mentioned, to empower co-creation of solutions and cross-sector collaborative innovation. This is taking place through the webinars, which are designed to provide knowledge and insights, bringing together industry and academia experts. Each one of these webinars are followed by an innovation lab, which are where we invite large organizations to provide a challenge, and SMEs are expressing an interest, are invited to express an interest on this challenge, and then the teams are being matched, and we are moving into the workshop. The workshops are being facilitated by our team at Future Everything, and the whole purpose is to create innovative solutions. Now, what is a challenge? You might be wondering. This is anything that could provide an opportunity to innovate towards a creative or expert solution. It can be internal, external, strategic, operational, organizational, customer related, supply chain related, or anything in between. Now, this is all from me for now, and I'm going to introduce Vika Shah, former chair of Future Everything, an entrepreneur and philanthropist based right here in Manchester. And he's also a visiting professor at MIT Sloan in Lisbon and an honorary professor of the Alliance Manchester Business School. We're very happy to have you with us, Vikas. And this is now for you. Go.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. And thanks for joining us today. I thought I'd start with a quote, from a professor who said that he was part of the team that created the algorithms that allow platforms to grab, manipulate our psychology. And, for him and his opinion, the future is far scarier than any of us think. I mean, there's several things about this statement which are particularly scary. I mean, first of all, is the fact that the statement is completely made up. Some of you may have noticed that Professor Haas S. Sakiv is basically my name backwards. Neither of those institutions exist. And also neither does the face. So the face that you see in front of you, that's never been a real human. That face was generated using OpenAI's algorithms that sampled what human faces look like and has generated a completely artificial human face. It's not an individual that has ever existed in the history of humanity. But it raises questions, doesn't it? Because to the untrained eye, and actually with a little bit of extra effort, you can make extraordinarily convincing looking people, statements, and change opinions. And this is just one of the many ethics concerns that comes out of technology in today's world. It's not just the, robots are coming to steal our jobs trope, which so many people talk of, but it's the reality of how we as human beings interact with technology, how we understand what's true, what isn't, what's right, what isn't, what's good for us and what isn't. And we're going to dive into many of these topics today in digital health, civic data, AI, IoT, security, privacy, diversity, and inclusion in technology. And maybe even Professor Haas Sakiv of the Norwegian Institute of AI Research will make another appearance, who knows? But I'd like to first of all introduce our first speaker for today, Professor Andy Meyer, who is the Chair of Science Communication and Future Media at the University of Salford. His research examines the transformative implications of emerging technologies, and he's published widely on issues such as transhumanism, genetic enhancement, artificial intelligence, and science communication. And we're really, really excited to have you with us today and really excited to hear from you. So I'll hand the screen over to you, Andy, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Vikas. I hope you can all hear me fine. It really made me laugh when you shared that image of this fake researcher. It made me laugh especially because I thought, well, it sounds about right, doesn't it? The quote's actually quite plausible in terms of reflecting our future and where we are. So it's I think interesting that we are able to see some truth within the quote. And I just want to make sure that I'm on the screen because it's still got Vikas on the screen. Is it switched over yet, Vikas? Let's have a double check.
George, is that switched over?
Yep, I'm on screen. Great. I just have Vikas, which is absolutely lovely. So it's so hopefully you can see me. And yes, this is I think a wonderful sort of intro to the sort of, I guess, ambivalence we have about technology, in particular data and digital technologies. And it sort of allows us to think about the duality of where we sort of sit within our present times. And on the one hand, we feel that our future should be sort of something like this, where we can imagine living in virtual reality simulators, seeing the world through alternative lenses, and hopefully seeing new ways of thinking about the world and making sense of it and understanding it. And we have events like this, which is a new augmented reality, well, mixed reality experience called Hadosport, which takes you into the future of hybrid sports where the physical and the digital are brought together. And yet this question about the future and our title for today, Our Digital Future, the first thing that it invites me to consider is, who is the our in this title? Who do we think about when we ask this question? And you'll be forgiven for perhaps first thinking about yourself, which is quite normal, I would say. You are part of that future. But of course, it's so many other things as well. It's so many other people, so many other entities that we have to consider. And it might be your immediate sort of significant others, your family, your friends, the people that are nearest and dearest to you. It might also be people in your organization, your colleagues. It might be your company as a concept. It might be the customers that you have. It might be the region in which you are located, the country, the planet, and yes, even the universe. And it's probably no surprise to you that over the last week or so, we've heard some news that suggests we might discover life outside of planet Earth. And of course, it's very popular now to start thinking about planetary health as being a unit of concern within how we go about everything that we do. But as President Trump starts to arm his space force, we start to realize that there's a whole different approach we need to take to our sense of responsibility to not just each other, but to the wider world in which we live. It's not just us that's at stake, it's everything around us. And yes, the planet and the universe at large. We already have around 35,000 pieces of space junk floating around orbit. And we seem as a species to be very good at polluting everything that we come into contact with. So for me, this raises the question as to how we think about our digital future. And George asked me to approach this talk by thinking about defining the problem and then offering a solution. So for me, the problem is how we think about that collective entity that we call our within this quote. It's all of those things that we've talked about and so much more. The philosopher Richard Rorty talked about the circle of solidarity as the principle that governs our sense of moral concern. And this does extend well beyond even biological life. It's as Vikas mentioned, the idea of robots taking our jobs. The first thing I thought about was a car washer, a robot car wash. And of course, those have replaced humans in many ways. And we've seen a progressive and incremental transition where robots and machines more generally, and of course, software specifically, taking over all aspects of what we do. But the question about defining the hour is really difficult because it changes over time as well. If you ask that question to yourself, who is the hour in this title for today, you may answer that differently if you'd asked it 20 years ago, and you may answer it differently 100 years from now. So being able to come up with an answer that is fit for purpose today, but allows us to think about where the technology is taking us in the future is one of the biggest problems I think we face. And you could argue that, in fact, historically, it's been a failure to really adjust our boundaries to that temporal change that leads us into the situation we are now, where we see a whole range of global catastrophic risks that surround us, and where we're now hopefully kickstarting initiatives to address some of these things. And you will have heard about this sort of claim in the context of climate change and the pandemic even. So the principle of there being the need for change isn't just related to the climate, but it's also the digital climate in which we live. And I think that's really the nature of the problem that we face. And you might have seen, and I want to mention this because George also raised it last week with me, you may have seen on Netflix in the last week or two, that's been the most popular film on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, which is a film that's about the Silicon Valley industry and how it's essentially, for many people that have worked within that context, feel that it is manipulating people, and talks about a cacophony of disasters that is emerging out of this context, where we have not just the risks to our personal life, the idea that it's affecting our relationships or affecting our perception of truth, but even more significant, the actors within it, and I say actors because there's a combination of people that have worked within the industry, but also it's dramatizing elements of this problem as well. They also talk about digital as an existential threat. So it's not just about truth, it's not just about information and misinformation, it's actually about the survivability of the species, which is profound, I think. And yet I don't think people often think about digital in such terms. We hear about it in the context of AI robots that may take over the world, but actually that notion that misinformation is really at the heart of what that documentary is about. And what they ask for is a transformation to how we think about and make sense of the digital world in which we live. So this principle of there being an existential threat, of course, requires us to think about the implications of this and how we design digital differently. And I was thinking about a kind of a modern day equivalent to the idea, which I think is built into this entire documentary, but into the entire thesis, that digital is of great concern. And it's the quote, "The pen is mightier than the sword." And I was trying to think of a sort of modern equivalent of this. And I've not quite worked it out, but the digital is mightier than the drone representing the modern day and indeed future, very not just near future, but already here future of warfare being conducted by uncrewed vehicles. And this is a useful metaphor for thinking about what is the potentially most destructive sort of vehicles that are out there. And yet digital is more powerful than this. In fact, of course, those drones are operated by digital platforms. So we have a sense in which digital is the all-powerful entity that we need to turn our attention to. And we know that because it affects the way in which we see the world. We understand that it's affecting our perception of reality in ways that is damaging both to us as individuals, but also to the population at large. The problem with the documentary, I think, is that it falls victim to its own critique. It's being delivered by the platform Netflix, which is, of course, another filter bubble that we operate within. And so the problem with that I have with it is, why should we trust the documentary? The documentary is a node within this system that they describe as being corrupt and leading us into this catastrophic risk that we face. And the reason why that's important is because it tells us that the documentary in itself, the signposting of concern, is not enough. We need to do much more. We need to think about how we ensure that we don't all end up in our own Truman Show, where we have no sense of reality and where everything we see and think is truth is in fact a charade, or at least a partial truth of what's happening within the world. And so for me, it's much more about trying to cultivate a sense of digital resilience. And that concept is at the locus of what kind of change is required, I think. And there's so much that's palatable about that film, because we can all relate to the idea, much like Marty McFly, as you can see in this film here, Back to the Future 2, where he's watching 6 screens at once. I'm sitting here with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screens around me. We are sort of in that future already, where we're video hopping from one TikTok to the next, or Instagram, and it resonates. It resonates that we see people seemingly a little bit too involved with their digital devices. So we can understand the concern and we can relate to it, because our children also are obsessed about digital screens and so on. But pointing out the problem isn't enough. And I think what we need to do is cultivate that idea of digital resilience. And how do we do that? Well, I think that we can find some solutions in thinking about the problem slightly differently. The problem with The Social Dilemma, which is in the context of also the previous film, The Social Network, which was about the beginnings of Facebook, is that we need to think about the social good. What is the social good that derives from these platforms? How do we think about that differently? And they touch on this within the film. They talk about the need for ethical design. How do we design platforms that allow us to think about and use these environments in a way that promotes public good? And we do that by involving the public much more effectively. This is my solution. In order to approach the situation where we have ethical design within digital, where we have less concern about the future of AI and robotics, and more confidence in the possibility that we can build technology for the good, the public good that we care about, is to involve the public much more widely. We need to think about employing methodologies that we've seen develop within the context of citizen science, the methodology that many scientists are now employing in order to involve many more people within the development of their work. And we need to do that in the context of ethics and digital technology and digital design in particular. And just to wrap up, really, I'm conscious my term is almost up. It goes back to, again, this video, which you may remember, is from the opening ceremony of the London 2012 Olympic Games, where Sir Tim Berners-Lee was there at the heart of it, talking about the importance of the internet being available and for everybody. And I think many of us feel that we have lost that sense of public good that operates as the underpinning rationale for the internet, the underpinning aspiration for digital. And we need to recover that. We need to think about how we involve the public much more in the ethical design of technology. It's not an easy problem, because of course the intellectual property, the business models all rely on locking down those principles. But if we don't do that, we end up in the situation where this global catastrophic risk is far more imminent. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I want to just encourage everyone, as you're hearing our speakers today, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please put any questions in there that you'd like us to put to our speakers in the Q&A section, which we'll come to in a little while. And I think with this in mind, we're going to move on now to our thought provocations. And it's interesting what Andy was saying, because sometimes we think about digital and we think about it as being a new thing, but technology has always been with us and it's always been changing us. Just one classic example, which you can always think about, is it was only when the light bulb became a generally available innovation that people were able to really stay awake when it was dark. Until that point, as soon as it went dark at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock or wherever, humanity fell into a circadian rhythm and went to sleep. But now the electric light has changed everything. And so technology fuses with society in really unusual ways. And so there's a lot of historic narratives for that too. So at that point, I'd like to introduce our first thought provocation speaker. So Emma Coleman, who is project director at Up Ventures, formerly with Government Digital Services and a former digital director with City Hall London, where she built the London Data Store. She's a phenomenal digital leader in the public and private sector, lives right here in Manchester, where she built the Federation, which is an open community of digital businesses and innovators built on cooperative values. She's a non-executive director of the Transport API and a project director, as I said, with Up Ventures. And she's going to present a thought provocation to us now. So screen is yours.
Thanks very much, Vickers. So I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully this will work. So can everybody see that? Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Vickers. That's very kind of you. So basically, and Andy, that was just a phenomenal presentation. I've got envy for those fantastic backgrounds. I'm going to be DMing you on Twitter to find out a bit more about how you did all that. But yeah, great to be here today. So I think for me, when I think about digital futures, data and ethics, we'll talk more specifically, of course, in the panel discussion, but I'd like to frame it in terms of these three things, which is really people, privacy, and profit. And they're kind of really interconnected in the way technology has developed, and particularly the behaviors of the kind of big technology firms. And I think it's really important. I mean, we're in a radically different situation now, aren't we, with pandemic and of course Brexit coming down the track, and huge implications for people, how they work, their survival, their futures. We know people coming off furlough, predictions are food banks use is going to increase by 60%. So we're in a really, really crisis situation for many, many people. And I think too often when people talk about technology, they don't think about people and the impacts on people. So, you know, I think we're going to have to think more closely about how do we make a better future for people? I mean, you know, in many senses, for people who are struggling at the edge, they're going to increase in numbers. This is an increasingly irrelevant conversation because they're struggling to survive. You know, I think it was one of the BBC journalists who says, you know, we're not all in this together. You know, what's happening here is that those who have privilege, you know, can isolate at home, have access to great technology, can stay connected because they have those privileges, which is fantastic. And that's been enabled by technology. But there are vast swathes of people who are now going to drop into dire situations. So I think that has to be first and center in our minds when we're having any discussions about the future. And I like to use this photograph of Mark Zuckerberg because I think in some way it kind of sums up the dystopian power that he has. I mean, that one, you know, and there was talk of him a number of years ago thinking of running for president. So let's think about that. You know, you think about, would you hand power to somebody who has such a vast, you know, tranche of data about us? And when I worked in government a number of years ago, people were always fearful about the kind of data that government had about them, you know, and I used to find that laughable because government may be okay at collecting data, but I mean, it's useless at storing it properly. It's in databases that don't even connect up together. So what government could actually find out about you through data previously was laughable, right, compared to what your mobile phone operator could find out about you. But now, especially with COVID, we're seeing more and more data being collected. There's a huge focus with people like Dominic Cummings as the Prime Minister's advisor on data. Now, I'm very nervous about the idea of governments getting better at collecting this kind of data when you couple that with the swing to authoritarianism, which is what we're seeing. So here we have a growth of right-wing politics here in the UK, and you have, you know, a sudden interest in government collecting data. Well, I think that's a position we need to be fearful of because authoritarianism and data has never been a good look, right? And it's never been a good consequence for mankind. So I think we need to be fearful. And I would encourage people to read a very interesting book called Democracy for Sale, which is written by a journalist called Peter Gagan. And it's a really interesting in-depth analysis of what's happening in terms of the impact that these companies are having on the democratic process. So for example, the, you know, really detailed use by political parties of Facebook data. You know, this is shaping what our democracy is becoming. And there are questions, you can ask about, are we essentially even living in a democracy anymore? So, you know, the impact of these technology companies is vast and deep, and people need to start to ask some very serious questions. And the last thing I'd say is that we need to start looking at new economic models, because, you know, we don't have examples of successful technology companies that have scaled, that have done so ethically. I mean, all have an extractive model, and we are basically the product. So when we go back to the situation of people, you know, needing to find jobs, needing to find work, well, when you think of it, we're all unpaid labor for these technology companies. You know, our content is what builds their profits, but we don't receive anything for it. So, you know, do we need to look at a model where those who have no other alternatives and can't find work, where these technology companies start to pay? Because for our labor, for what we contribute every day, every hour, every second of every day, we're pumping in content from which they derive profit. And the other thing is their model is, you know, vast investments, subsidizing, you know, Uber subsidizing drives below cost so they can get to scale and then exit at these insanely obscene amounts of money for which 10 people benefit. You know, we need to start looking at economic models where we are building equitable businesses, you know, that are sustainable. They may not be unicorns, but they employ people and give people jobs. So I think that's my call really is, you know, we'll obviously get into more detail in the panel, but that, you know, we are living in very, very difficult times. We need to acknowledge the impact and dystopian impacts that these technology companies have had. And we need to rethink where we are going in terms of our economic models.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that, for the wonderful presentation there. And you know, there's a lot of things in there which I'm sure will be getting us all thinking, and I'm hoping we can discuss that more in the Q&A. And it's really fascinating what you say, because in theory, you know, the reality rather, as it was portrayed in The Social Dilemma, is there's a small group of people sat in Silicon Valley who are controlling how society thinks through providing those nudges onto these wonderful little drugs we all carry around with us. So next up for our next thought provocation is Michael Chapman. So Mike Chapman is a program manager with Allscripts EMEA Solutions team. He spent a lifetime working in the program and business management world, originally having been in the construction sector. He moved into healthcare IT in the 1980s, worked in technical program consulting, operational management, and eventually became a board level director at the NHS, in suppliers to the NHS and in the big data research field. He's always had a real focus on getting things done and has spent a lot of his career kind of shaping working relationships and how to get the best out of teams and client organizations. Right, are we back? I'm not sure entirely what happened there. My screen literally just cut off for a moment. But with that, over to you, Mike. I think you're on mute there, sir. Just bear with us one moment. We're having a slight technical issue here. So, George, if you can maybe unmute.
All right, I've found it.
Yeah, have you got it? Great.
Can you hear me now? You got me?
Yeah, we've got you now.
All right, everybody. Sorry about that. As that glitch happened, the main part of I lost part of the screen and lost the controls on the screen. So hopefully, it's a good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am somewhat in awe following the last two speakers. The sheer range and scale of both of their interest areas of experience and the depth of their knowledge of the broad issues around data and ethics. And as a citizen who has watched this develop from a stage when this wasn't even a thing one could worry about. Everything was written down in paper ledgers and there was no machines to analyze it, that I've watched the problem develop. I've been working, as Vikas said in his intro, and thank you for that, that I've been 40 plus years in industry, 10 years in construction, and I've been serving the public sector either inside local authority or healthcare, or with companies serving the public sector for just over 30 years. Interestingly, following Ema's challenge there, that I work for one of those big American corporates, but I've worked in SMEs, I've worked in public service directly, so I have watched the challenge and seen it from all sides. My company is in healthcare. So narrowing the scope of our discussion somewhat to an area that has a lot of immediately obvious ethical challenges, and we're blessed in the UK that within NHS, there isn't a dispute really about who owns the data, it's the patient, and health authorities hold it on their authority. But the challenge that is developing is that the more we want to, for the benefit of the nation's healthcare and for citizens, want to dig into that data to find out that you see Ema's point about handing over control to governments to do the analysis is how do we ensure that that is appropriate and ethical? There are many, many petabytes of data about your healthcare available. At the moment, it's mostly locked up in separate silos. We do systems around the country in healthcare IT in the secondary care area. We're seeing these challenges, the data not being joined up, inadequate interoperability. There are issues around the ability of the clinical teams to cope with demands. And this is what's happening in healthcare IT, is that the pieces of the jigsaw of caring for people are being joined together. The data is being drawn together. The scale of the data silos that can be mined is getting greater. Not all of the data is well and accurately recorded. There's a desire to do more patient engagement. Later elements in the Innovate Manchester, like the fourth one, which covers patients, the user-centric design, about getting the engagement right. But the challenge that I'm seeing is that health data has been gathered. Drug research has been going on for 30, 40 years. I've worked in organizations that hold global drug consumption data. It's not personally identifiable, but there's a vast amount of it. And for medical research, work is done with healthcare data at patient level. It would stress to everybody who's joined this that there is a strong governance in the UK around the use of clinical data for research. There is clear guidance on the ability for citizens to have their data removed or not be available for secondary research. But in trying to get more of the data available for research to benefit patients, the quality of the original data record is a challenge. It was not gathered with the idea that that data would be fit for reuse. So, challenge is, should we use AI to mine that historic data, bearing in mind that there are all sorts of challenges around the way it was gathered, different purposes for which it was gathered. The reason that a GP collects your primary care data is different from a cardiologist recording data about you to treat a specific condition. Should we focus on collecting future records with better consistency? Coding. Coding today is something that happens and is used for research. In reality, that coding has been applied to drive the billing. It's not clinical terming. Clinical terming is possible, but very difficult to do quickly while recording information about a patient. So what happens is we actually get data that's driven from the bill. And I think Emma's comments would recognize, and Andy's, that if what you know about a patient is primarily driven by how you got paid, there might be something that needs more work. Terming is so difficult, actually, that is an area that AI is being talked about as a means of effectively listening to the clinician and applying the terminology. How do we think about making that work safely? Is that ethical? Can a machine ethically apply a set of clinical codes about the condition that you are being examined for, treated for? And that last challenge really is the big one. You need, if we're going to use data in healthcare to benefit citizens and the planet in terms of how well we can treat people, you know that genomics is here and live and active. The challenges around using that well and ensuring that governments and healthcare businesses treat that data appropriately. And I am absolutely with him on the challenge of a drift to right-wing views of authoritarianism. This has not played well in history. And you only have to go back 80 years to know that from census issues that occurred in Europe, that we need to be on our guard. Nonetheless, in my world, we really want to be able to provide better data for patient care. How do we do that well? That's my challenge.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael, for that. And sorry for the slight technical glitch we had during your intro, but everything seemed to run very smoothly following that. So what I'd like to do now is just make sure that obviously everyone's putting their questions into their Q&A, because we've got some time now until we wrap up just before 11 to speak to all of our panel. But if I can just maybe make a start with a couple of questions, actually. Oh, sorry. Let me just skip back for a moment. I've in my error there, whilst we jump through the schedule, I missed out our next thought provocation speaker. So my apologies, Annette Joseph, founder of Diverse and Equal. So Annette attended the Tech Inclusion Conference in London back in 2017, and it was a transformational experience and really set the fire going within her to champion diversity and inclusion in technology. And she's made that ongoing commitment to speak up and amplify that message. And it's what she's been doing ever since. So Diverse and Equal was formed to champion changing the narrative of diversity in technology from one of ethics and to what a nice to have to one which is based on evidence, performance, and profit improvements. And Annette, I'm extremely sorry we jumped past you there. I was dealing with a whole bunch of messages about that little glitch we had, and I just scrolled past it. My apologies for that, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Vikas. Let me just share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So I'm the founder of Diverse and Equal. Today, I'm going to focus mainly on the gaps in data around the experiences and needs of people from underserved communities and how that lack of data can negatively impact not only the products and services, but also the people that they're meant to serve. I'm really happy to be here today. Like Michael, I'm in awe of all the other speakers, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So a little bit about me, a little bit more. I've been working in and around tech for about 30 years as delivery manager and agile coach at the Co-op. I worked across the business on various projects, including one which explored how to make fair use of data across the organization. I left the Co-op just over a month ago to work on Diverse and Equal full time. So we are a tech for good organization. Our aim is to use tech as a vehicle to create a fair society for everyone by equipping people from underserved backgrounds with the skills to fulfill crucial roles while empowering organizations to embed cultures that embrace and celebrate difference. Over the past 2 years, we've worked with organisations to help them understand the benefits of diversity and embed the cultural change necessary to unlock those benefits. We've also worked with curious and passionate problem solvers from every ethnicity, every gender, every religion, every socio-economic background, adults of varying ages with transferable skills gained from working in other industries, many of whom embark upon careers in tech after starting their journey with our workshops. So in January, we'll be kicking off boot camps that equip people with skills to fulfill entry-level roles in various disciplines. So today, the conversation about ethics and data has been like really interesting. And I love what Emma was saying about the effect on people in terms of what we do with data. And I'd like to follow up with that by discussing how gaps in data caused by discrimination and exclusion can mean that we create products that negatively impact daily life for those who are underrepresented. So the effects can range from annoying. So the image on the left is that of a Daily Mail article about a doctor who was locked out of a women's changing room because Pure Gym don't recognize doctor as a female title. A couple of years ago, there was a story of a racist hand soap dispenser that would only dispense to white hands. And then on the right, there's a story from New Scientist about how voice assistants struggle to understand commands from women. So we go from the annoying into the life-threatening. As we said before, we talked about facial recognition. Facial recognition at the moment is 10 times more likely to misidentify Black women. And when data shows that Black person 78% of the time is charged rather than cautioned for the exact same offence versus a white person at 44%, a misidentification can actually be life-destroying. There have been calls for a moratorium of facial recognition algorithms across the board until they're fit for purpose. And so I think I agree with that because it is causing quite a bit of disruption to people's lives. And then also, if a woman's involved in a car crash, she's 47% more likely to be seriously injured, 71% more likely to be moderately injured, and 17% more likely to die. And that's because of how the cars are designed. These examples are all to do with how and who designed and tested these products and services. And these are just a few examples of many. So my statement, I guess, is as people who work in tech, I feel like it's our responsibility to ensure that our data considers the full story and that the products and services we create do no harm. It's up to us to ensure that all of our users' needs are considered. When experiences of whole communities are missing, this tells us a lot about where we place value in the society that we've actually built. Filling our data gaps is beneficial for society. It's good for business. Ensuring our data sets are robust and inclusive allows us to uncover the unknown unknowns quickly so that we don't end up making the kinds of mistakes mentioned in the previous slides and by the other speakers. And this is where the many benefits of full spectrum diversity in the workplace and inclusive user testing can play a crucial role. It could also contribute to the digital resilience that Andy spoke about earlier.
Great. Thank you so much, Annette. And it's such an important topic, and it runs right from diversity inclusion at C-suite level in large businesses through to even how products are designed as well. You know, one of the classic examples of this is how most hardware, so the mobile phone or iPads, you know, other brands are available, but most hardware is designed by men and user tested by men using, you know, male hands. And so as a result of that, the user experience for women is diminished. So this affects consumers and businesses and everything. So I really appreciate you flying the flag for this and championing it. So at this point, we will go into our Q&A. Apologies once again from that. And so we've got a few questions that we kind of pre-prepared as well, but I want to make sure that we deal with our audience questions first. And also make sure you do contribute to menti.com with the code you've got there, which is 5226508. There's some questions on there for all of our attendees as well. So the first question, and I'll throw this open to the panel, so whoever wants to answer, please feel free to chip in. So Catherine Thomas asks, is there a way for us to manage these challenges as individuals in terms of protecting our privacy and freedom of information? Or is this an area that government and corporates need to intervene to introduce better regulation? So whoever wants to take that one, feel free to jump in.
I'll take that, because if that's okay. I mean, I absolutely believe without a doubt that regulation is needed. There is, I think where the large tech companies are right now, they're trying to say they can self-regulate. I don't believe that for a moment. I mean, there's nothing in their business models that would indicate they're able to do it. The problem is, government is always slower. And so we don't have regulatory expertise in the same way as we didn't have in the Electoral Commission. So the Electoral Commission were really asleep to what was happening in terms of the use of Facebook and data, and being able to work around their rules for funding political parties, etc. So we really need to look urgently at improving the technical capabilities and bringing in technical experts into these areas that are traditionally thought as more, accounting or auditing based. So technology needs to be at the heart of everything now, and certainly so at the heart of government. I mean, we've seen very recent ruling from the European Commission where Facebook is now saying that if it proceeds, they'll abandon Europe and just focus on the US. I think that's an empty threat. I don't think that's going to happen, but certainly I think regulation is an absolute must.
Great, thank you for that. Another question from Jamie Stone, which is, and again, I think this is a great question given the documentary we've all spoken of, which is, have we passed the point of no return for our digital lives? And if we have passed that point, should we be focusing on mitigation instead of actually focusing on the fact that we are being subverted? So whoever wants to take that question, feel free.
I mean, I'd love to have a go at it. I think it's always an interesting question to see whether we can sort of roll back on the impacts of technology. And I guess my take on it is, in fact, we can't. The technology is out there. Even if you stop using Google or stop using Facebook, the other billion people aren't going to rush to stop it. And that's partly because we also believe it enriches our lives. This, I think, is the sort of myth of the unspoken narrative within that film, The Social Dilemma, is that we also believe genuinely that our lives are improved by digital. So I think instead we can look at how we cultivate that concept of digital resilience. And a simple way of thinking about it is through education. Kids are not taught anything about this in school. So how do you build a population of people that are mindful of the concerns and indeed informed by the values that we're talking about? If you don't have any platform for education at all, then there's a clear answer. It's really simple. It's really simple. Just teach people about these issues, teach resilience, teach literacy, and we have then a growing population that's much more attuned to this. And I think it's evident. It seems so simple, but we haven't done it. And that's beyond belief to me.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we've got a question for Mike Chapman from Bill Jones. And so Bill asks, and I think it's actually quite a relevant question, because oftentimes when we talk about data and health, we talk about the negative aspect, which is data leaks and so on. But the question from Bill is, how can data be used to improve communications for patients and families? So Mike, that one was for you.
Thank you, Vigas, and Bill, thank you for raising that one. Well, I suppose the positive thing is to say that the healthcare provider industry and the technology providers are very aware of that need. The technologies are here. Some of the revelation of slipping into a pandemic and lockdown was that the GPs discovered that there were other ways to talk to them other than having to queue up on the phone at 8 o'clock in the morning to get a booking to go and sit in their waiting room and catch a cold. And that they started using technology that would actually use that. All of a sudden, the healthcare embraced the ability to use the media, social media platforms, the communication platforms like Zoom and things like that. However, the big challenge really is not about that. It's actually, it's the people and process part of the three-leg stool. Technology is nowadays generally ahead of that. the people and process, the challenge that the industry has in serving patients well in this sector is actually organizationally changing, to understand that for many patients, the care is across a broader spectrum. What is happening is that instead of treating care in silos, it's moving into a community-based model, much more joined up. Hospitals, community healthcare, social care are linking up. And the piece that is as yet missing is joining that care pathway together and engaging the patient and their families as part of it. It's not something that the service should do to people, it should engage them. And the people and process changes are underway. To Emma's point, anything that you try and do at a national level, and you try to lead through government initiative, is slow. And we have healthcare is cautious about making change because of the danger of making mistakes. So while we want it to change, and many of the doctors want it to change, the rate at which we can do it is really around people and process and the rate at which human beings can absorb change.
Great. No, thank you, Michael. A question for Annette, actually. So so David Butler highlights an often unspoken of problem actually with technology, which is, so David says it's great to see that, you know, inclusivity being highlighted, but sometimes we don't get the basics right. So in his example, for instance, people with hidden disabilities are proven to be loyal workers and want to work. However, they're often overlooked or face barriers such as, you know, technology which does not have live subtitles for the hard of hearing. And this is a really important point because it's not just about diversity and inclusion in the management of business, but how technology adapts to people that need those adaptations. So it'd be great to get your views on that, Annette.
I think that comes down to the user testing again. So whenever you're creating a product or service that is supposed to go to users, it's about making sure that it's tested with as many people as possible, and making sure that there's diversity in that user testing base. So getting people who are neurodiverse, getting people who have disabilities in that testing to make sure that those unknown unknowns come to the fore. Because it's often not until you're halfway through designing something that you realize that there is actually a flaw. So it's important that the testing gets done widely.
Great, thank you. And actually, in our group chat, one of our attendees, Kendrick Curtis, has actually asked the question: do we have live subtitles for this event? And the answer is, no, we don't. And actually, this is an area where technology does need to catch up with reality in terms of how easily these adaptations can be put into systems. But I think this is a really live and important point. A question for Emma. So Smart Cities COM asks, are any governments doing anything to iterate, test and learn from the start of an introduction of new technologies or data applications? I think that's actually another way to perhaps phrase that is, from your experience, Emma, which governments are doing this well, which governments are deploying technologies well, and what are they doing perhaps differently from ours?
If you'd asked me that question the day before yesterday, I might have had a different answer because I would be quite negative. But actually, George from Future Everything, who's on with us here, pointed me towards an article he'd written or read about Taiwan and the Taiwanese government, who have had a fantastic response to COVID in terms of working with, in a really agile way, in terms of track and trace and all sorts of technologies related to COVID. And that's been, they've collaborated with small companies. They've been really open. I mean, they've been open and trusting and collaborative, right? And that's quite unusual. So they've allowed those kind of agile players in. What you tend to see with governments and municipalities and the smart city space, and I actually hate the term smart city, but anyway, is that they tend to work with large systems integrators, for example, or you have large companies like Siemens or Cisco who want to control the platform. And again, you're getting into that, proprietary, closed, locked down. So they're not generally good at developing agile solutions, opening up to smaller players. So I would say rather than a city as a platform, which is discussed, You need things that mesh together. So something that's open source that works here, that can be knitted up together here. 5G, for example, if you look at 5G, that would never work unless you have government working with outside providers in an agile way. The last 5G, or attempted rollout of 4G in London was caught up with a whole sort of debate around masts and state aid, and so it's a very, cities are complex entities. And so the narrative is very simplistic. It's about platforms, as if you can insert a platform and everything will work off that. And it simply doesn't work because the infrastructure of cities is a tangled mess. So it's a much more complex. But I think if governments can be open to more agile players who are not just trying to grab the market. I'll finish by giving an example. When I was in London doing the London Data Store, it was a really hot topic then, data and smart cities. But every company I met, they wanted to be the ones first to market. They didn't want to collaborate with anybody else. They wanted to own the space. And until governments can learn to collaborate properly, it's going to be very slow movement around smart cities.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And it's actually really interesting. So through our businesses, we do quite a bit of work in the Emirates. And obviously the Emirates are a bit of an odd island because they have basically unlimited budget. But when you see the type of collaboration between governments there, and how health data and other things are transported between nations in the Emirates quite effectively, I think that is again a good model, as is the South Korean model. Question from Ian Bennett for Andy, and I think it's quite a relevant one for us today, given the appearance of Professor Haas Sakiv earlier. So, how do we prevent the spread of fake news without affecting free speech and expression? And also, what responsibility do the social media conglomerates have in relation to this? So over to you, Andy, for that one.
Well, I think there's two parts to this problem. One is about the spread of fake news, and the other is about how it affects our lives. Because of course you can have, I think one of the problems is that there's been a real blurring of boundaries within digital platforms, where you take your Facebook stream, for example, and all content is blurred. There aren't channels that are news channels, there aren't channels that are entertainment channels, and so on. And I think the harder part is to prevent the spread, but it's probably the least important part either, because all that we really want to make sure is that we can help people develop those skills that allow them to critically work through what's true and what's not. So I think if by focusing on the impact that it has on our lives is the most important part. And there have been attempts to sort of guide people through that. Even Facebook and some of these platforms have now integrations that encourage you to think about, looking at different sources and thinking about whether you've actually read something before you share it. And I think there has been a bit of a shift in that direction, but making sure that, again, we focus on that part of the problem, I think is crucial. I think there's always been fake news that spread. You don't have to look too far to find it, even outside of digital platforms. So I think we are sort of stuck with that. There are, and always have been, charlatans. The key part is building those critical skills to make sure that it's just taken for granted, that we don't just assume that what we see is truth. I mean, that's a simple message, but it's a lot of labor to get it across to people on a continuous basis when you have platforms that are continually changing.
Great, no, thank you. And actually, for anyone who's interested in this topic in particular, there's a great book that's come out recently called Calling Bullshit. And that book actually is an absolute dissemination of all the techniques that are used by statisticians, by publishers, by the news media for manipulating evidence, and actually how we can actually build tools into how we read and interact with media to start asking the right questions of what we're seeing. But it's a massive area. A question from El Kanagavel, sorry for butchering your name there, but it's a question for the whole panel, so whoever wishes to take it, please jump in. But the question is, many businesses in the UK and around the world rely on Google and Facebook as their advertising platform to customers. What code of ethics should businesses follow to make sure that they're advertising ethically on platforms which they have come to depend on? And what do you think of attempts to boycott those platforms, such as the hashtag Stop Hate for Profit campaign? So whoever wants to jump in on that, please do feel free.
I'll jump in on that, because I think I totally support those campaigns. I think that's one of the ways that people can fight back and call out kind of bad behavior. But ad tech is fundamentally broken. I mean, it's broken. Even the guy who invented ad tech has ad blockers on his phone. So, it's completely out of control. I don't think these companies even understand themselves at this stage. So you have, it's I would say, companies need to just step away from the platforms and say, until you can show transparently where ads are placed against our brands, then we're not advertising with you. I mean, surely that's a no-brainer. So I think people, some companies are still caught up in this. We have to be there. We have to be there. It's like, really? Do a bit more hard work. Ask some harder questions. You've got a moral obligation to do that. But it's a broken system, ad tech.
Yeah, I think this is really important, really, really important point, actually, because we've come to depend on these platforms for so much of our lives. But as is often the case, if it's for free, you've got to ask the question, well, who's benefiting? And the truth is, it's not the person who's getting it for free in most cases. A question that was sent to me via Twitter, actually, for Annette, which was, we've had so many initiatives around diversity and inclusion and technology, but oftentimes the reality is boards aren't changing and companies are doing it often for what appears to be lip service. How can we encourage more diversity and inclusion in tech, but in a meaningful way that starts to create real change? So a great question there for Annette.
Thank you. So that was one of the reasons why I started up my company. So we've been talking about diversity and inclusion since the 70s. And the reason why it's not going anywhere is because often organizations and people within those organizations see that argument as, or see the mission as an ethical, it's the right thing to do. And while it is the right thing to do, when something pressing comes up for the business, it's easy to push that thing aside and focus on something more meaningful. So one of the things that I started doing when I started working in this space was looking to change the narrative. So instead of focusing on the right thing to do, actually speaking about the business, the tangible business benefits of diversity and inclusion. So a McKinsey report, there's been loads of reports, but McKinsey report shows that for organizations that are gender diverse and inclusive, they report 21% higher profits. And when you add ethnic diversity into that mix, it's between 33 and 35% additional profits. That's huge. So when we start talking about those kinds of numbers, when you start talking about diverse teams being 50% more innovative, making better decisions 2 times faster with half the number of meetings, those are tangible things that make a real difference to a business, and also focusing on the fact that in this global economy, if you're not diverse, you're not going to be able to compete. And also with Gen Xers, Gen Zers, millennials coming out and working, that generation, they actually will prefer organizations that are diverse. So when we're in an economy or in a space where there is a skills gap and organizations are competing for digital talent, you have got to have the best environment possible to attract the right talent. So if you're not diverse, you're just not going to be able to compete. So I think it's around changing that conversation, talking about the true tangible benefits rather than just the right thing to do.
Great. No, I think great answer. And actually it leads into another question that's come in from the audience, which I'm going to throw open to the whole panel as well, which is from Najma Patel. So Najma says, technology has changed people's lives positively. Unfortunately, the negative aspects, such as harvesting data to feed fake news, has impacted people's trust. How can tech companies regain the trust of their users and the wider population? Great question, and from Najma, and whoever wishes to take that one, do feel free to jump in.
I'll happily have a go at it. I guess for me, it's always been the case that technology brings with it both positive things in our lives and negative things. And you can look across the history of technology to see that. I think that the question of trust is born out of a kind of set of relationships that's been created, where it's almost like technology when it's really advanced is like magic. We can't understand it, and that lack of understanding is already a precursor to a lack of trust. And so building openness into the system is a crucial part of gaining trust. If you don't have that, then it's really hard to go any further in building it. So I think recognizing that where there's an absence of openness, you will end up in a situation where there's a lack of trust. So perhaps looking at that as a unit of indicating whether in fact it's possible is the starting point, because I think without it, you won't happen.
And I think I'd love to also just ask Emma and Michael this as well, because, you know, you're both in spaces where trust is key, you know, whether it's civic trust of technologies that are deployed by local and national governments, or whether it's trust in the systems that people are using for health. So I'd love to get both of your reflections as well on what you feel technology companies in your sectors could do better to get the trust of their users.
Well, I think what Andy's saying is correct. I mean, I think it's about openness. So my experience, I mean, I've worked in local government, I mean, like pre-technology. When you work in, I worked in communications in local government, and local government problems are complex things, whether that's education problems, et cetera, and the real way to get people to understand is to be truthful and honest, and to explain the trade-offs. You know, any government decision involves difficult conversations, and my experience has always been, the more open you are, the more people understand. They can kind of get that. You know, you can say, look, this is a complex problem and there's no easy solution, but here's one of them. What do you think? And when you have that kind of dialogue that's open and honest and transparent, sometimes people will even vote for things that are against their own interests because they're doing it for the greater good. So people are willing to engage in honest debate. The problem is, Sandy says, it's so frictionless, right? Facebook's terms and conditions are like longer than the American Constitution. You know, nobody's going to read those. So it's about doing the hard work to make it simple, and doing the truthful and open thing so that people understand the exchange. I mean, if I'd been asked 15 years ago, you know, if you give me all your data, if I can read every document that you send, if I can know where you go, and you'll get a free email in exchange, would I have taken Gmail? Well, I'd answer no, obviously. So I think it's about trust and openness and honesty.
Thank you.
Can I add to that, or is Mike coming in?
Please, Mike. Please go ahead.
Oh yes, Andy, I'll jump in after me. I would absolutely back up the offering there of openness. As the providers of technology, and certainly with that UK perspective, we provide the technology. We certainly don't, as providers of that technology, take any sense of any ownership or rights to any of the data. That's quite clearly it's something that lies with the NHS, and we are all very fortunate that is the structure we have here in the UK. The difficulties are, I think, around the way in which to make the patients feel comfortable that their data is being cared for appropriately, because it is, as Emma said, a complex subject. It's very difficult to engage somebody at the level of depth to explain to them a data sharing agreement, which has been signed between two parts of the NHS that are sharing patient data, is a bit like the terms and conditions for Google. And therefore, the patients won't read it. How do we get them to understand that care has been taken, that there is a binding relationship between the parties doing that? I'm not sure how you simplify a complex relationship management. It's water dripping on a stone. I think you need to keep working at it. You need to keep enforcing that this is being done right. You can't get most people to exceed and understand all that is being done to protect their data. We need to keep the narrative going so that trust is sustained.
Yeah, great.
Can I just add a follow-on, please?
Please, Andy, go ahead.
Because it sort of follows on from what Mike has been saying as well. We recently completed a project at the University of Salford, working with the University of Bath, on what we've called the digital health generation, where we spoke to children between the ages of 12 and 18 about the future of digital health. And one of the questions we asked them was how they would feel about artificially intelligent healthcare providers or services provided by AI. So the typical thing is something like an AI chatbot that is helping to triage or diagnose your condition. And a lot of them said that we are quite comfortable with that. And I think it's partly because they've already been brought up on AI-backed services, whether it's an Amazon assistant or something like that. And so from their perspective, these processes, these possible futures are great. If they work better, then wonderful. But the problem I think we face that's not part of that initial conversation is, what if the use of these platforms leads to a gradual erosion of I guess, impact or significance within the NHS? If more data passes into these private firms and less data into the NHS, then it progressively becomes weakened as a service. So you might end up going 10 years from now to the Google hospital rather than the NHS hospital. And so the problem of openness also needs to get to the heart of the problem of prediction and anticipation of some of these impacts, in order for us to really be cognizant of the impacts of what we're doing in terms of data sharing, or indeed embracing commercial partnerships.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I just want to bring in Annette on this one as well, before we then move to a kind of a roundup question for the panel. But on the trust piece, Annette, it seems in many ways that we're also moving to a situation where a lack of diversity in the companies providing our products and services could mean that certain communities do feel distrust towards those businesses as a result of that. Is that something that you're seeing? And does diversity also impact the trust that the end user cohort will have for a company and its products and services?
Yeah, absolutely. And that trust isn't unfounded. It's all of the algorithms, all of the that have already been written already have bias in them. It's people who write algorithms, and the bias that those people already have go into those algorithms. So that mistrust is not misplaced. Like I said, there's the people are already calling to have the facial recognition, having put a moratorium on it because it's not fit for purpose. And, it doesn't recognize Black and brown faces. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. So, yeah, we really need to get more people into the organizations that are actually creating the algorithms and all of that, to make sure that it's fair.
Yeah. No, thank you, Annette. And I'll just a roundup question for the panel, because then I want to actually hand over to George, who's going to run through the results of our Mentimeter and the topics that people have been discussing on there. But, I think I always like there to be a sort of follow-up point or a follow-up action that we can all take. And so I'd just like to ask each of our panel members, whether it's a book or a resource that you'd like us to look at, whether it's an action that we can take in our own organizations, what's the one thing that we could all do following today's event to really move ourselves forward when it comes to our core topic of the day? So maybe I'll go in the order which you're on screen. So maybe Michael, will come to you first.
So what can we all do? I think that we have to engage intellectually and then follow up in the way that we lead our lives, with 2 points that have come up in the last few minutes. One is to question everything that we read in any kind of open platform. Pick carefully sources of news information, and your opening statement with the quote was an absolute example of, crikey, that's quite strong, plausible, and then completely made up, presented in a way that in an environment where you think, this is, am I being told the right thing? So I think we have to be very careful about what we believe. Therein lies the challenge about ensuring people trust data, because if they haven't engaged in checking that what they choose to read has provenance and has some merit, they don't know, or indeed have built a pattern of behavior that says, I can't trust any of it. It is a personal challenge for all of us to work on that. Because if we don't fix that in our own heads, we won't be able to make a wider picture. Ethics is about being able to come up with decisions around correct behavior, set in an environment where every single one of us has a different set of boundaries. It's a huge challenge, but we've got to grasp that ourselves. Starts with us.
Great, thank you, Michael. And so next up on my Zoom screen is Emma.
Yeah, and because I'd just like to recommend two books. One I mentioned earlier, which is called Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics by Peter Gagan, who's an Irish investigative journalist. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. And I'd read that in parallel to James Bald's new book, which is called The System, Who Owns the Internet and How It Owns Us. It's a very, I mean, particularly James Bald's book around the internet. It's a really, really good non-technical read, but I think it really gives a broad picture. And when you align that, as I say, with the political spectrum, it's quite an interesting insight. And I think the more informed you are, the better you're able to make choices and call out these kind of bad behaviors, because it can seem very complex, but actually, I think James Bald's book is a must read.
Great, thank you, Emma. Annette.
So I have two pieces. So for just for the general public, I would mirror what Michael said about questioning everything, and basically, building on your critical skills, and not trusting what we see, just digging a little bit deeper. And then also for us as technicians, who people who build products and services, go out of your way to make things simple and be inclusive. Make sure that your full, not just your target market, but every possible user of your service is included in the building of that service.
Great, thanks, Annette. And Andy.
Thanks, Vikas. So I posted in the chat a link to our website, thedigitalhealthgeneration.net. And for me, it sort of resonates with my main message, which is to really understand what's happening in the lives of young people online. If you have children, speak to them in more detail about their experiences, if you can, because it's so crucial that we understand what habits are being formed. And I will bet you most of what young people below the age of 18 are doing online is incomprehensible to most of you. And actually, this is important because it's the next generation of habits and assumptions and behaviors and expectations that's going to shape that next generation of online users. We've already had over 15 years of Facebook now, and what's the next 15 years going to look like? I think understanding the lived experiences of young people is crucial to do any work in this area.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to just ask George to bring up our Mentimeter, which gives us a bit of the conversation that's been happening amongst the audience, some of the key topics that have been coming up there. So here are some of the answers that we've had so far. So the first question that we'd asked everyone is, how much do you trust the way AI is used in your everyday life? And it's really interesting because, you know, it's fairly split. So, you know, there's quite a large cohort of people that have said that they don't trust AI or have a little bit of trust. But then actually, you know, an actual surprisingly high, perhaps, number of people who said that they do. So maybe if anybody wants to share a quick reflection on that before we move on to the next question. I think one quick reflection from me on that is I think some of this is an education piece. You know, AI is one of these things which science fiction takes a lot of ownership of in terms of our negative perception of it. And we are some distance away from the kind of general AI that people do perceive as being the threat. Typically what people talk of as AI in reality is just machine learning. And actually in many cases is actually a very, very positive thing for services. George, perhaps let's take a look at the next question then that we got to. Great question. So which of the below implementations of AI and its data do you think has the greatest impact on our everyday lives? So, you know, quite unsurprisingly, the large proportion of people thought social media, then automation of jobs and civic data scored very low. Personal data collection was there as well, and health data. If anybody wants to maybe chip in on this.
Interesting, Vic, is that people are not as concerned about automation, because I mean that's going to have a profound impact on the future of work.
Yeah, I agree, and I think one of the things which people often forget is it's very easy to buy into the messaging that we see from cities around the world, which is, you know, digital this, digital that, before realizing that when you take a sweep of where the sectors which contain the largest cohort of employment, oftentimes those are the industrial and manufacturing sectors, which are also being disrupted by digital to the extent that now the prerequisite level of digital skill you need to even perform what was previously considered quite a manual job is actually quite high and excludes quite a lot of the population. So perhaps let's look at the next one, George. Great question. How do you think an ethical framework for AI should be determined? By business, 8%, makes sense. By governments, 20%, lower than I perhaps would have thought. 28% would trust NGOs to do it, even though oftentimes they are funded by the businesses which only got the low votes. And the highest proportion of people think that ethical frameworks for AI should be determined by democratic consultation. So any views on this?
Well, this was the question I added in, so I'm very pleased to see this sort of response. And I suppose the complexity of democratic consultation needs unpacking, but certainly I think most of us feel very disempowered around questions of design around digital platforms. So it probably speaks to the fact that it's gone so far out of our control that we've just lost all capacity to even intervene. But it certainly seems like a sort of a social mandate to really rethink how the public are involved at the very micro level. If you work in a business and are designing AI or designing digital solutions, make sure that the public are present within that process. That's a simple way in which you can begin that conversation.
Great. Well, no, and those were all the questions we had on Menti. But I think this has been a really fascinating discussion because, a lot of these questions now are not questions of at some point in the future. They're questions of what's happening here and now. And we have to also take the positives along with the negatives to the extent that, for example, for any of you that have used 23andMe to do your genetic data screening, yes, you're giving up some small component of your genetic data, but you're getting a huge amount of health data in return. So these are the kind of challenges that we all have to weigh up as individuals based on our own ethical considerations. But I just want to take a moment there to thank all of our panel for attending, for your incredible contributions. I've been scribbling away notes in the background here as well. And I'd love to just hand over to George for some closing remarks and to tell you all the next steps for today. So, George, over to you.
Thank you, Vikas, and thank you everyone for the contribution. You can see on my screen where we left the presentation in regards of like the program overview and what's happening. I've described that today we're in the webinar, and in 2 weeks' time we have the Innovation Labs, and this is where we're inviting large organizations to join us, share their challenge, a problem statement, something that relates to their supply chain, customers, internal organization, and everything in between. Get in touch with us to ask how we can support you. The Innovation Lab process, to give a bit more insight of what is happening on the first day, is focusing on the problem opportunity analysis, understanding of what the problem is, and then on the second day is focusing on the solution design side of the process of the lab, and this is where we are actually becoming creative and we're trying and start to shape the potential solutions. Now, a quote from Chris Berkeley, Market Access and Public Affairs Director at Chiesi. We are very happy to see that organizations that have joined the previous Innovation Lab and webinar are moving forward with the solutions that have been created and put together, as well as that matching SMEs and large organizations to work together is something that is working out very well. And from the audience and from everyone that has attended the Innovation Lab, which I have to remind is invite only, unlimited places available. So if you are thinking of pushing a challenge towards our team, please make sure that you do that. So people have actually said that it was better than expected and much better than expected. And the rating was 8.4 out of 10. We have 2 challenges at the moment. One from the National Cybersecurity Center, which is discussing citizens' data, which was also part of the discussion that took place earlier. The challenge is on the screen. Increasing citizens are beginning to have to share their data increasingly citizens are beginning to have to share the data to participate actively in society. How do we ensure that data are collected, used, and shared in the right way so that the citizen can trust the system that they interact with? And the second challenge from Allscripts UK is about clinical data record, and the recorded in point of care health record system is increasingly broad and comprehensive. As the amount of information increases, it becomes harder for the clinicians to see and rapidly understand the important things while maintaining ethical standards. How can healthcare IT help clinicians make better use of the patient record data? Just to also provide a reminder, large organizations have around 48 hours from now to bring forward their problem statements, their challenges, and SMEs are going to be invited to register their interest in these challenges, including the two that I've just presented to you on Friday, 25th. That was all from us. Thank you very much for your time and for your contributions. To everyone, Vikas, Andy, Michael, Emmer, Annette, thank you very much for being here today with us, and for everyone that has attended the webinar.
Thanks, George.